Hayden Rooke-Ley has been interested in healthcare systems for a long time, even before he went to Standford Law School. And he's now chair of the Legislative Committee for Healthcare for All Oregon, and has a lot of inside views on things like ERISA and waivers for Medicare. And he also holds the Division III record for 3 free throws as a basketball player. So, Hayden, you're on.
Mike had to do that to me. Great. Well, I'm excited to talk to everybody here today about some kind of wonky legal issues around state single payer. I don't know if folks, I can start off and just sort of give an overview of the questions that Mike asked me to address. A lot of this comes out of extensive sort of conversations and thinking I've had with a couple sort of co-authors in the legal field, one being Professor Aaron Fuse-Brown, who's written on issues around ERISA and Medicare waivers and some of the hurdles around getting state funding or federal funding for state single payer. She and I have actually collaborated on some other work and are in sort of continual discussion around these sorts of issues. So I'm here to sort of communicate some of those discussions to you all and hopefully answer any questions if there are any. My top line point on well, I guess there's two separate questions. The first is how necessary is an ERISA, basically a congressional law that gets rid of ERISA, which I'll explain in a second. And what are the legal challenges to getting a hold of the federal Medicare money that would need to come into a state for a state single payer? Addressing the first question. So ERISA, I don't know if everybody's heard of this. Again, this gets into like really sort of technical legal issues. ERISA is a state law that essentially a federal law that essentially preempts states from regulating health insurance, and particularly from regulating self-insured plans. So about half the country has insurance through their employer. About half of those folks have insurance through a self-insured employer. And ERISA is a law that basically a federal law that basically says to states, hey, you can't get in the business of doing this sort of regulation. We're the federal government. When we speak about an issue and we want the state not to speak about an issue, our declaration is predominant. So there's a lot of sort of a lot of debates around whether on the extent to which this law prohibits states from essentially regulating their health insurance systems. And specifically, the question here is if a state were to try to do a single payer plan, would they be in which you would, get rid of private employer insurance, do everything that Warren just talked about, and fund the plan at the state level? Would you run into issues of ERISA preemption? Or would you need a law like SABUCA that basically states from federal Congress that we're not applying the ERISA problem to this issue, essentially create a super waiver, as has been stated? The top line answer to this question is state-based single payer act SABUCA would be great, but it's not necessary in order for a state to construct its own single payer healthcare plan. I can get into the details if folks are interested, but basically there are at least 3 ways to construct a single payer healthcare plan that we think would probably avoid a challenge from the courts that would strike down the plan. One thing about ERISA and sort of the jurisprudence around it is it's highly uncertain and we never know. For folks on the West Coast who are under the Ninth Circuit, which is one of 11 circuits, appellate circuits that are under the Supreme Court, under that jurisdiction, we actually have particularly favorable case law on ERISA that has basically said that you're allowed to tax private employers for public health care plans without running into ERISA issues. So the top line message is states states could pursue single payer without necessarily running into ERISA problems. It's possible, and this is why if we could pass SABUCA and get rid of this issue, that would be fantastic. The second issue that Mike wanted me to talk about is the Medicare waivers. As I think folks are probably aware, the overall hurdle here for single payer is getting, or the overall financing challenge is getting all these funds into one place at the state level and being able to construct our own program. As you all know, a lot of healthcare financing comes from the federal government. And there's currently a question of whether a state can get a hold of the bulk of that funding, which comes from the Medicare program. And here as well, the law isn't entirely clear because this hasn't been tried before. There have been some folks, mostly one specific law firm out in Washington, D.C., who did this analysis for California single payer folks, and basically concluded that there is likely statutory authority in Medicare to delegate the funds to the state to allow them to construct their own single payer program. This would be through the CMMI, which is the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation. This was a sub-agency that was created in the Affordable Care Act that tests various payment models. It's largely associated with accountable care organizations, alternative payment systems. There are a million different buzzwords for sort of this move to value-based care. And CMMI has not used its authority to allow a state to pass a single payer plan. They've been really focused on these value-based care models. However, the statutory authority that CMMI has is incredibly broad. So it appears that this is probably, again, more of a political problem than a legal problem. If an administration under a Bernie Sanders wanted to change their sort of the direction of CMMI and test a model at the state level that could be mandatory and that could be essentially a single payer model, there's nothing in the statute that says they can't do that. And again, the CMMI authority is quite broad to basically allow the agency to waive aspects of the current Medicare law to permit a sort of system like this. There are, as with ERISA, there are at least 3 ways you could probably do this. And again, I want to caveat everything because this is uncharted territory. And we know, particularly these days, the way that the federal judiciary likes to get in the way of democratic legislation. But there are probably 3 ways to do this. One could be through an ACO type model, like a state-based ACO type model. The second, and this is specific to what Mike asked me, whether the state could essentially stand up its own single Medicare Advantage plan. There, the question was posed whether the requirements in the Medicare statute that requires Medicare Advantage to be basically a program of choice to allow beneficiaries to choose between traditional Medicare and Medicare Advantage, and within Medicare Advantage to be able to choose amongst plans. In order to sort of deal with that provision, again, the waiver authority is really broad. So you would waive that provision in the Medicare statute to allow for a single Medicare Advantage plan that would be basically the state of Oregon's Medicare Advantage plan that would be mandatory and would be the only plan. And then the third way is a little bit less clear because it's sort of so novel, and that would be what I think probably most of us think of as the cleanest single payer route, and that would be to essentially have CMI just give the money to a state and say, here's all the money from Medicare, set up your own plan, basically with the same requirements that they give to all their payment models. Again, these models that they test, which is that it needs to not raise the total cost of care, and it needs to improve quality. Again, the sort of broad discretion to CMMI to try all sorts different sorts of payment models. And we do find precedent for them not only dealing with Medicare. So CMMI has models currently that cover dual eligibles, so Medicaid beneficiaries as well. So that would seem to indicate that CMMI is not restricted to only dealing with Medicare, as some I think have proposed. I'll stop there as sort of an overview. I hope that was somewhat coherent, and gives some understanding of kind of the issues that we're thinking about. I'd be happy to delve deeper or try to clarify anything within the ERISA question or the Medicare waiver question if there is interest.
Any questions for Hayden? Bobby Hall from Corvallis.
I just wanted to thank Hayden. I think he made it very clear that the ways are clear. If the powers that be, that would be supervising or looking on at which one we chose, was used. The statutory part seems very clear because, as he pointed out, these things are not specified in detail. So I think that sort of forces us to look at the structures that would be looking at these, so that these options are presented in the appropriate way to look at, as he has looked at it. And I wonder if he has any suggestion about what we can do to assure that.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I'm understanding your question, I think the most important part here is, as you know, first and foremost, single payer advocates, we think about sort of what's our most likely path to trying to get this done. And I think a lot of us work both at the federal and the state level at doing this. So I think the balance that we have to strike is both pushing forward legislation at the federal level that could help rally support, bring attention to this issue, make people realize that states are interested in pushing for single payer, and legally, again, I want to stress, pave the path. It would be incredibly valuable and clarifying if SABUCA just passed and we could sort of get all of the lawyers out of this and take this question off the table. That would be great. The risk, however, is if it's portrayed as mandatory, then we risk sort of stifling efforts at the state level to actually do this sort of thing. And I go back to a couple anecdotes as an advocate in Oregon. Particularly, my biggest concern is particularly with folks who are sort of tend to be on the Democratic side, but sort of aren't fully in on single payer. And oftentimes I'll hear them invoke some of these legal technicalities. Oh, we can't do single payer here. I would love to do it, but we can't do it because, you know, the ERISA problem. And that's what concerns me and gets back to the point that, you know, this is fundamentally a political problem. And, you know, we don't want to be in a position where we can't act unless we somehow convince a Republican House of Representatives to go for single payer at the federal level. So I think this is the tricky dance that we have to do as a coalition, to try to pursue any avenue we have without thwarting another one. Paul, I see you have, well, maybe to other hands who are here, William or Barbara.
Barbara's first. Barbara Pearson, you're up.
Okay, so once again, I thank you in clarity, except not 100% clarity on my part, not your fault. But it seemed to me at one point, and I'm from Massachusetts, we have a plan that, you know, considers that we haven't figured out how we're going to tell them how much Medicare money we want, right? But I thought I heard you say we have to get that money through CMMI. So I'm just wondering how we can get CMMI to do anything we want. That even if it's, they seem to be doing stuff based on no evidence. They're doing what they want. They have a plan of what they want to do. They're not improving.
Your signal is breaking up,
We're
Barbara.
going
Can
to
you?
ask them to go a bridge further.
Oh.
I don't know if this helps. Does this help?
Yeah, that helps.
Okay.
Can you repeat your question? Yeah.
Well, the question is that I heard Hayden say that it was going to be CMMI who gave my state the money from Medicare, not Medicaid. And already I've been asking myself since I heard of DCEs, how can we stop CMMI, right? And it could, I don't even think an act of Congress could stop them at this point, but it might be able to. But how are we going to get them to do even more, do more toward a simplified, I love your term, Warren, simplified payment plan.
Yeah,
I mean, how does anybody get them to do anything? I mean, it's a monster.
I appreciate that question. I think I would answer it in two ways. One, first of all, Congress could end CMMI if they wanted to. They can do whatever they want with that program. They created it. But within the statutory framework that exists, I definitely think in the Biden administration, we've seen a move in a better direction with CMMI. I still think they are focused on the types of kind of ACO capitation based models that I think are not our best, the best way to spend our energy. However, they did just release a new model that starts to get a little bit closer actually to some of what single payer advocates think about through what's called the ACO ahead model. But secondarily, states can come to, and California's trying to do this now, states can come to CMMI and propose these models and work with them. I mean, Maryland has done this with their waiver. So it can be a collaborative relationship between a state that wants to do something, and preferably if the state has already acted, then there will be immense pressure on CMMI and Medicare generally to approve it. And this again gets back to this larger political question. CMMI is part of the administration, so we sort of have three avenues here at a broad base. We have states can try to act, then we can have Congress act, which is what the Sabuca efforts are, and then an administration try to act. And if the Biden administration was inclined, or if we had a different administration in there, if they were inclined, it appears that the statutory authority exists. So again, this gets back to this political question we have, which is what's our likeliest path through all of those? And it's none of them seem promising, tomorrow, but there are such great efforts at all these different levels. And I think it's just important to keep to recognize that nothing hard in law is stopping any one of these avenues from being pursued. And we want to, I think, keep them open because we don't know which way this political winds are going to blow. And they're always different when we're talking about a president versus the power in Congress versus a given state.
Or if we're talking about Becerra, I'd much rather ask him.
Right. And that would, right. So, I mean, but, and this is, so Becerra has the power over CMMI and Biden has the power over Becerra. So ultimately, again, a high profile issue like this, like if a state were to really pass a single payer program, I can imagine immense political pressure, particularly on a Democratic administration that purports to care about single payer. I could imagine strong political pressure that could get them to basically accept what the will of a given state has passed to do their own system.
Well, thank you. Let me let others go.
Oh, Bill, you're up. Bill Bronson from California.
Hayden, can you provide us with concise language that we could each put into our respective state legislative models that would address these two agendas? Is there a way to put words into a piece of legislation? Let me say one more thing. I'm convinced that no state legislature will ever pass a true single payer bill, because the lobby amount of money is just too enormous. And regardless of what they say, they won't vote for it. So we are ultimately faced with having to move this agenda with a proposition. I know that many states don't have a proposition capacity, but if the states that do essentially move towards that agenda, that approach, we would be able to bypass our legislatures, and we would have to have a proposition whether we passed it by legislature or not, because there will be suits filed by the oligarchs against this transformation. So first of all, we need clean language. The bill that I drafted called ourhealth.pub.public on the web is the most comprehensive and imaginative single payer bill in writing in the country today. All it is a draft policy model for study and consideration, but I would like to be able to put block language into that document that you might provide us that would address the ERISA question, however you wanted to frame it, and the consolidation of federal money into reimbursement to states.
Yeah, I mean, I would point here to the language that exists. I mean, the Oregon task force looked at this specific issue and provided, I think, some helpful language on addressing the ERISA problem. I know the Healthy California task force, or whatever that was called, did the same thing. I don't know if the proposal is to get it in an actual bill to sort of head on address these questions. That's an interesting idea. I'd have to think about whether that, in some ways that brings attention to particular legal issues. That'd be I think a more strategic political question that each state would have to consider. But there's certainly text out there that addresses, I can't take credit for any of these ideas. I've learned from legal scholars who have looked at these issues, and that certainly exists on the internet, and I can provide that to Mike if helpful.
That would be very helpful. And I'd like everybody to relook at ourhealth.pub, in order to look at what an ideal model would be like. What's going on here in California, of course, is that there's a very ferocious split between the group that wants to preserve Kaiser's insurance penetration through what they call unified financing, as opposed to a true single payer bill. But if we had the language, that would be very helpful, because we're going to have to go to the people with a compelling and inspiring campaign that's going to have to deal with the disinformation that's going to be plowed at us by the oligarchs, and to oppose any major vote on single payer in this country anywhere.
Okay, I think I'm up. The tobacco company was brought down by a paper, the Brown and Williamson papers, showing that over decades, they knew that what they were selling was lethal and morbid to a large population. We have more evidence than the Brown and Williamson papers now that our current system is lethal and morbid to a large percentage of our population. Is there a legal aspect to do like Ash did? I forget the lawyer's name who pursued this. A legal action against the medical industrial complex?
Yeah, there are probably better legal experts to try to address this question than I am. I mean, I do think
somehow I muted you. Can anybody hear Hayden? Oh, you can. Okay, I can't.
connection between what a particular given actor is doing and the harm that's created. I don't want to purport to be able to answer that question. I haven't seen any of those legal theories out there. I will say one interesting idea to try to get at a particular part of the healthcare system that I've been thinking a little bit about is trying to address the role that insurance companies play in making medical decisions. This gets into its discussion about basically corporate control of medicine and the degree to which states want to enforce their bans on the corporate practice of medicine. And one interesting legal idea I think that I hope some lawyer pursues is to, under the state statutes that are supposed to ban corporations from practicing medicine, suing an insurance company, particularly a managed care company, for basically intruding upon the exam room and making medical decisions. So I'll stop with that one idea. Mike, I'm unaware of the larger question of whether there's something that could be done there.
Thanks. Bill, you're up. We have 3 minutes.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Hayden, could you speak some to the politics and practicality of a state that's considering enacting single payer legislation, contacting CMMI before they've actually passed the legislation?
Yeah, this is another idea that I think is in uncharted territory. I will say there's a lot of informal communication that happens between states and CMMI when they're thinking about developing waivers, and through all the application process. You know, there are people at HHS, people at CMMI who are working with states basically as they draft any sorts of waivers. And this happens continuously with Medicaid programs. So waivers are always being drafted for each state to construct their Medicaid program. So I think the way to find out here is to just try it. The folks I've spoken to about this issue seem to think that it's probably unlikely that you're going to get a CMMI or the administration to sign off on a plan before it happens, before anything sort of officially at the state level is enacted. Just because, again, from their perspective, what would be the point in doing that? Because they don't know it's going to pass. And frankly, they're going to think you're not going to pass single payer at the state level. No one's going to vote for that. Again, this is all speculative, and I don't want to act like I'm the authority here. I don't think anybody is, because this stuff hasn't been tried. But I would be, I could see this information being communicated, one, through back channels. So using connections to people sort of on an informal basis that they have at CMMI to sort of give them advice. And then in a more public facing way, again, it depends on the politics. Maybe there's an administration that wants to affirmatively proclaim that they're supportive of single payer and says, go ahead and do it. It's probably not going to be this administration. Or potentially if there was some official path that was taken at the state level to where they were, in an official way applying for a waiver, maybe that would compel CMMI to give them some indication of whether this is going to, pass muster. Sort of a non-answer. I hope that maybe provides a little bit of context.
Thanks, Hayden. And we're right at the top of the hour. So in honor of everybody's time, I'd like to close the meeting. We'll send copies of this, and you can always ask Warren for his slides. And I think he did put his email in the chat, so please record that. And we love these Friday morning meetings, and are open to any topics that you might wish to discuss on a third Friday. And also, to keep these wonderful meetings coming, please donate to One Payer States. Any other closing comments from Warren or Hayden?
Yeah, I know there were a couple questions in there. So if anyone wants to follow up, sorry I didn't get to them. Happy to answer over email.
Yeah, I'd emphasize again, if you want slides, or if you would like to actually set up a one-on-one discussion to go over some of the slides that maybe aren't clear, I'd be happy to do that. George@peak.org.
And Ellen Carell wants Hayden's email. Maybe you've already put it in, Hayden. Can you put it in the chat?
Yeah, it's in there.
Oh, it's in there. Okay, Ellen, it's in the chat. Okay.
Okay, I'll look for it.
Okay. Everybody behaved well. Thank you for all of that.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Rooke-Ley.